The Valorian citadel hung in the darkness of space like a crown of silver and light, spinning slowly above a world that belonged to no one and everyone. At the same time, Commander Elara Vance stood at the observation deck and watched ships from 100 different species dock at the station's massive ports. And she could not help but feel small in a way that had nothing to do with her height. She had commanded soldiers through firefights on 3 different continents back on Earth. And she had taught marksmanship to recruits who trembled the first time they held a weapon. But none of that seemed to matter here in the grand halls of the Citadel, where humanity was still considered the new species. The primitive ones. The evolutionary accidents who had somehow stumbled into faster than light. Travel 5 years had passed since first contact. And in that time, humans had learned a painful truth about the galaxy. They were not special. The Norvaxians stood 8 feet tall with muscles that never tired and eyes that could track a bullet in flight. And their reflexes operated faster than human thought itself. The Marathi could perform calculations in their heads that would take human computers hours to complete. Orvelians remembered everything they had ever seen or heard or touched. Their minds perfect recording devices that never failed, and humans. Well, humans died from falling downstairs sometimes. And they forgot where they put their keys. And their bodies broke down after 70 or 80 years if they were lucky. Elara touched the weapon at her hip. A kinetic pistol that her grandfather had made by hand in his workshop back in Montana. And she felt the familiar weight of it against her leg like an old friend the other species carried. Plasma rifles and neural-linked weapons that fired wherever their minds directed them. But Elara preferred the simple mechanism of metal and springs and gunpowder. It reminded her of who she was and where she came from. The door behind her slid open with a soft hiss. And Ambassador Yenli walked in with her small feet, making almost no sound on the polished floor. Yenli was a Scythian, barely 4 feet tall, with large dark eyes and skin that shifted colors based on her emotions. And right now, her skin was a worried shade of gray. Commander Vance, Yenli said in her quiet voice, the session resumes in 1 hour. And I wanted to speak with you before we return to the assembly. Elara turned from the window and nodded at the small diplomat who had fought harder than anyone to get humanity a seat at the table. What troubles you? Ambassador? Yenli's skin flickered to a darker gray. The Norvaxian delegation has been speaking against human integration all morning. And High Warlord Ketharan has made it very clear that he considers our species unworthy of full membership in the Defense Pact. This was not news to Elara, who had felt the weight of Norvaxian contempt from the moment she stepped onto the station. Ketharan was a mountain of muscle and arrogance. A warrior who had never lost a battle and never met a species he considered his equal. And he looked at humans the way a wolf might look at a rabbit. What does he want? Elara asked. He wants humanity relegated to support roles only, Yenli replied, her skin now swirling with frustration. No combat positions, no command authority, no weapons integration with the fleet. So we would be servants, Elara said flatly. Assistants, Yenli corrected. Though her tone made it clear she saw no difference. The Norvaxians believe that allowing humans into combat roles would endanger the entire alliance. And they have the support of several other species who share their doubts. Elara walked to a chair and sat down, her mind working through the problem the way she would work through a tactical situation. The Galactic Defense Pact was humanity's best chance at survival in a universe full of threats they barely understood. And being locked out of military roles would make Earth a dependent, a child species that would never be taken seriously. Why do we need to change their minds? She asked. Yenli's skin shifted to a thoughtful blue. Proof, she said simply. Proof that humans can contribute something of value. Something that the other species cannot dismiss as primitive luck or desperate ambition. The hour passed quickly. And soon Elara found herself walking through the grand corridors of the Citadel toward the assembly. all were representatives from 30 different species, waited to decide humanity's fate. The hall itself was enormous, built to accommodate creatures of every size, from the tiny Scythians to the massive Gorvak, who stood 12 feet tall and breathed methane through specialized masks. Alara took her place beside Ambassador Yenli in the human delegation's modest section, and she watched as species after species rose to speak about trade agreements and defense protocols and resource sharing. And then High Warlord Ketharan stood. He was even more impressive up close. His gray skin stretched tight over muscles that looked carved from stone, and his 4 eyes swept across the assembly with the confidence of a predator who had never known fear. "We have heard much talk today of cooperation and unity," Ketharan said, his deep voice filling the hall without effort. "But we must also speak of reality. And the reality is that some species are simply not suited for the demands of galactic defense." His eyes found the human delegation, and Alara felt his gaze like a physical weight. The humans are brave. I will grant them that. And their journey to the stars was impressive for a species of their limitations. But bravery is not enough when facing enemies who can think faster and fight harder and survive wounds that would kill a human 10 times over. Murmurs rippled through the assembly, and Alara saw heads nodding among several delegations. "What would you have us do?" Ambassador Yenli asked, her voice steady despite her worried colors. "Sit quietly while others fight and die for the safety of the galaxy." Ketharan smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "I would have you do what you do best, little ambassador. Would you support those who are actually capable of defending this alliance?" He turned to address the full assembly. "Every species has a defining gift, a trait that makes them valuable to our great pact. And the Marathi have their mathematics, and the Orvelians have their memory, and my people have our strength and speed and combat mastery. But what do humans have?" He looked at Alara directly now, his 4 eyes gleaming with challenge. "What gift does your species offer, Commander?" Alara rose slowly from her seat, and she felt every eye in the assembly turn toward her. "We have adaptability," she said in a clear voice. "We have the ability to learn and improve and overcome obstacles through practice and will." Ketharan laughed, and the sound echoed through the hall like rolling thunder. "Adaptability," he repeated with contempt dripping from every syllable. "Practice and will, those are not gifts, Commander. Those are the coping mechanisms of inferior beings who must struggle for what others possess." Naturally, Alara felt anger rising in her chest, but she kept her voice calm. "Perhaps you should not dismiss what you do not understand." "I, Warlord." Ketharan's smile widened, and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Perhaps you should show me instead." The assembly fell silent, and Alara knew that everything humanity had worked for now balanced on the edge of a blade. The assembly hall erupted in whispers and murmurs as Ketharan's challenge hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Alara stood perfectly still, her hands relaxed at her sides, and she studied the massive Norvaxian warrior who had just publicly dared her to prove humanity's worth. She had been in situations like this before, though never with such high stakes, and she knew that her next words would shape how the galaxy saw her species for generations to come. "What exactly are you proposing, High Warlord?" she asked in a voice that carried across the silent hall. Ketharan stepped down from his delegation's platform and walked toward the center of the assembly floor, his heavy footsteps echoing like drums. "The Citadel has a place called the Proving Ground," he said. "A facility where warriors from every species can test their skills against standardized challenges. And I propose that we settle this debate the old way, through demonstration rather than empty words." Ambassador Yenli grabbed Alara's arm, her small fingers surprisingly strong. "Commander, you do not have to accept this. He's trying to humiliate you in front of the entire assembly." "I know," Alara replied quietly. "That is exactly why I have to accept." she gently removed Yenli's hand and walked forward to meet Catherine in the center of the hall. And she had to crane her neck to look up at his face, standing this close to him. She could see the faint scars that crossed his gray skin, marks of battles fought and won against enemies she could only imagine. And she understood why his species believed themselves superior. They had been engineered for war, across thousands of generations. Every weakness bred out and every strength amplified until they had become living weapons. What challenge do you have in mind? She asked Ed. Karan's 4 eyes gleamed with amusement. Marksmanship, he said. The most basic of combat skills, the foundation upon which all warfare is built. And if your species cannot compete in something so simple, then there is no point in discussing more complex matters. A Marathi delegate called out from the assembly. High Warlord, surely this is unnecessary. We can evaluate the humans through their military records and training documentation without resorting to public spectacle. Catherine did not even look at the speaker. Records can be falsified and documentation can be exaggerated. But skill cannot be faked when you're standing in front of witnesses. And I want the entire assembly to see with their own eyes what humans are truly capable of, or incapable of, Elara thought. Hearing the unspoken words beneath his statement, she thought about what she was risking by accepting this challenge. If she failed, humanity would be locked out of combat roles in the Defense Pact, reduced to servants and support staff for species who would never respect them. If she succeeded, she might earn humanity a chance to prove themselves further, and if she succeeded spectacularly, she might change everything. I accept your challenge, she said. The assembly exploded in noise as delegates from every species began talking at once. Some excited by the prospect of entertainment, and others concerned about the diplomatic implications. But Elara ignored them all. She was already preparing herself mentally for what was to come. Catherine smiled that predator smile again and extended one massive hand. Then we have an agreement, Commander, and I look forward to showing the assembly what true skill looks like. Elara took his hand, her fingers tiny against his enormous palm, and she squeezed with all her strength. She knew he barely felt it, but she wanted him to know that she was not afraid. So do I, she said. The next 2 hours were a blur of activity as word of the challenge spread through the citadel like fire through dry grass. By the time Elara reached the proving ground facility, it seemed like half the station had gathered to watch the spectacle. The proving ground was a marvel of engineering. A massive chamber that could reconfigure itself to test any combat skill from any species. And today, it had been set up for marksmanship trials. Holographic targets floated in the air at varying distances, and sensors lined every surface to track projectiles with perfect accuracy. Ella stood in the preparation area and checked her weapons while Ambassador Yenli paced nervously beside her. I have researched Norvaxian capabilities, Yenli said, her skin a storm of worried colors. The reaction time is measured in hundredths of a second. Their visual acuity can track objects moving faster than sound, and their neural-linked weapons respond to thought alone. I know, Elara said calmly as she inspected her grandfather's pistol. Their top marksmen score in the 97th percentile on standard galactic assessments. And Catherine himself holds 3 planetary records. I know. Yenli stopped pacing and stared at Elara with those large dark eyes. Then how can you be so calm? Elara slid the pistol into her holster and looked at the small ambassador. Because I have spent my entire life preparing for moments like this. Not because I knew this specific moment would come, but because I knew that someday I would face a challenge that seemed impossible, and I would need every hour of practice and every lesson learned to overcome it. She touched the pistol at her hip. This weapon has no targeting computer and no neural link and no stabilization system. And it requires me to do everything myself, to aim and breathe and squeeze and follow through. And I have done those things 10,000 times until they became part of who I am. Nenli's skin shifted to a thoughtful blue. You truly believe you can win? I believe I can show them something they have never seen before, Alara replied. And sometimes that is more important than winning. A tone sounded through the preparation area, signaling that it was time for the challenge to begin. Alara walked through the doors into the main chamber and was greeted by a wall of sound as hundreds of spectators from dozens of species cheered and shouted and made noises. She had no names for the observation. Galleries were packed with beings of every shape and size, all of them eager to see the primitive human humiliate herself against the genetic perfection of a Norvaxian warrior. Kethran was already standing at the firing line, his neural-linked rifle gleaming under the arena lights, and he turned to watch Alara approach with that same confident smile. I am glad you did not change your mind, Commander, he said. It would have been disappointing to deny the assembly their entertainment. Alara took her place at the adjacent firing position and drew her pistol, and she heard gasps and laughter ripple through the crowd as they saw her weapon. To them, it must have looked like a museum piece, a relic from a primitive age, a joke. Good, she thought. Let them underestimate me. Let them all underestimate Mechadharon looked at her weapon and shook his head. You cannot be serious. That thing belongs in a display case, not a proving ground. This weapon has never failed me, Alara said, and it will not fail me today. The High Warlord's smile flickered for just a moment, something uncertain passing through his eyes. But then it returned stronger than before. Very well, Commander. Let us see what human skill truly looks like. He raised his rifle and faced the targeting field. Ladies and gentlemen of the assembly, the arena's announcement system declared, the challenge will now begin. The arena fell silent as the first wave of targets materialized in the air. Glowing blue spheres that began moving in complex patterns across the targeting field. Kethran moved first. His rifle came up in a blur of motion that Alara's eyes could barely follow, and the weapon sang a high-pitched whine as plasma bolts shrieked through the air. Target after target exploded into showers of light as the Norvaxian warrior demonstrated exactly why his species was feared across 12 star systems. Did not aim in any way that Alara could recognize. His neural-linked weapon simply responded to his thoughts, firing wherever his enhanced eyes focused. And his enhanced eyes could focus on things moving faster than any human could track. The crowd roared with approval as his score climbed higher and higher on the display screen's 90% accuracy. Then 93, then 95. And the targets were moving at speeds that would have been invisible to human perception when the first wave ended. Kethran's final score glowed on the screen, 97.8%. He lowered his rifle and turned to Alara with that same confident smile, and she could see the certainty in his 4 eyes. He believed this contest was already over. Your turn, Commander, he said, gesturing toward the targeting field. The system will adjust to human baseline parameters, slower targets and shorter distances, so that you have a fair chance. Alara stepped forward to the firing line and drew her pistol, and she heard more laughter from the crowd. At the sight of her primitive weapon, she ignored them all. No adjustment necessary, she said to the arena's control system. Maintain Norvaxian standard difficulty. The laughter stopped. Kethran's smile faltered. Commander, that would be suicide for your reputation. The targets at Norvaxian standard move at speeds your species cannot process. Maintain Norvaxian standard difficulty. Alara repeated. A murmur ran through the crowd as delegates leaned forward in their seats, suddenly interested in a way they had not been before. Ambassador Yenli watched from the observation gallery with her skin cycling through every shade of worry that existed. The arena's control system chimed its acknowledgement, and Alara raised her pistol. She did not wait for the targets to appear. Instead, she closed her eyes and breathed. slow and deep, and she let her mind settle into the state. She had trained herself to reach. Over 20 years of practice, her instructors at the academy had called it the quiet place, a mental zone where conscious thoughts stepped aside and pure trained instinct took over. When she opened her eyes again, the world looked different. The targeting field materialized with dozens of glowing spheres that immediately began their high-speed dance across the arena. And to anyone watching, it must have looked like chaos, like random patterns impossible to predict. But Alara had spent her life studying patterns. She had learned that nothing was truly random, that every system had rules and rhythms if you knew how to look. And she had trained her brain to see those rhythms the way a musician hears melody annoys her. Pistol came up, and she fired. The recoil was familiar. An old friend, and she was already adjusting. For the next shot before the first round reached its target, she did not try to match Ketharan's speed because she knew she could not. Instead, she did something different. She predicted. Her brain tracked the patterns of the targets, analyzing their movements and calculating where they would be in the fraction of a second it took her rounds to cross the distance. And she fired not at where the targets were, but at where they would be. Bang, bang, bang. 3 targets exploded in sequence, and the crowd's murmuring grew louder. Alara moved through the exercise like water flowing downhill, each shot feeding into the next, her body turning and adjusting with the efficiency of 10,000 hours of practice. She did not think about what she was doing. Thinking was too slow. She simply let her training take over, trusting the muscle memory she had built over 2 decades, trusting the instincts she had honed through countless exercises and real combat situations. The targets came faster and faster, the arena's difficulty scaling up as her accuracy held steady. And still Alara kept firing. Her pistol clicked empty, and she ejected the magazine and slammed a fresh one home without ever taking her eyes off the field. A reload so smooth it looked like a magic trick. Bang, 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 bang. The crowd had gone completely silent now, watching with disbelief as the primitive human with her primitive weapon matched the performance of a genetically perfect Norvaxian warrior. But Alara was not just matching Ketharan, she was doing something he had never even attempted. Each cluster of her shots formed precise patterns, groups so tight they could have been covered by a coin. And as the exercise continued, those patterns began to form shapes, a triangle, then a square, then a star. She was not just hitting targets. She was placing her rounds exactly where she wanted them, down to the millimeter, demonstrating a level of control that went beyond mere accuracy into the realm of artistry. The final wave of targets appeared, moving at speeds that would have been impossible for any unenhanced human to track. But Alara had stopped trying to track them. She knew where they would be. Her last 6 shots rang out in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat, and 6 targets exploded in perfect sequence. The arena fell silent. Alara lowered her pistol and let out a long breath as the world came back into focus around her. Heart was pounding, and her hands were trembling slightly from the adrenaline. But she kept her face calm as she turned to look at the score display. 98.4%, higher than Ketharan's. Silence stretched for 3 heartbeats, then 4, then 5, and then a Scythian delegate in the front row began to applaud. The sound strange and small in the enormous arena. Another joined, then another, and suddenly the whole observation gallery was exploding with noise as species from across the galaxy rose to their feet. Ketharan stood frozen at his firing position, his 4 eyes fixed on the score display, as if he could not believe what he was seeing. A Marathi scientist was already pushing through the crowd toward the arena floor, his calculator mind racing to process what he had just witnessed. The weapon, he called out as he approached Alara. I must examine the weapon. There must be some hidden technology, some targeting assistance we could not detect. Alara reversed her pistol and handed it to him. Rip first. Marathi turned it over in his hands. his large eyes scanning every surface, and his expression shifted from suspicion to confusion to something that looked almost like fear. "There is nothing," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet arena. "No computer, no stabilization, no neural link, no enhancement of any kind. This weapon is nothing but metal and springs and chemical propellant." He looked up at Alara. "How is this possible?" Alara took her pistol back and holstered it. "Practice," she said simply in the observation gallery. Ambassador Yenli's skin had shifted to a color no one had ever seen before, something between gold and silver, something like hope. The arena was still buzzing with noise as Catharan walked across the floor toward Alara. His massive form moving with a tension she had not seen in him before gone was the easy confidence. The predator's smile, the casual contempt in its place, was something raw and unsettled. Like a creature encountering something it did not understand for the first time in its life. He stopped in front of her and looked down with all four of his eyes. And Alara met his gaze without flinching. "Explain this to me," he said, and his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear. "My people have spent 10,000 generations perfecting our bodies, breeding for speed and strength and precision, and we have become the greatest warriors in the galaxy through the slow, patient work of genetic selection." He gestured toward her holstered pistol. "But your species has existed for the blink of an eye, and your bodies are fragile and slow and weak. So how can you do what I just saw you do?" Alara considered the question carefully before answering. This was the moment she had been preparing for without knowing it. The moment when she could either crush an enemy or create an ally, and she chose her words with the same precision she used when placing her shots. "You were born perfect," she said. "Your speed and your reflexes and your vision, all of those things, were given to you by the generations who came before, and you never had to struggle for them." Catharan's eyes narrowed. "You say that as if it were a weakness." "Not a weakness," Alara replied, "but perhaps a limitation, because when everything comes naturally, you never learn to push past what is natural. You never discover what lies beyond your genetic boundaries." She drew her pistol again and held it up between them. "My reflexes are slower than yours. That is simply true, and my eyes cannot track targets as fast as yours can, and my muscles tire in ways yours never will." She turned the weapon over in her hands. "But my brain has been trained to compensate for all of those things. Not through genetic modification, but through repetition and failure and adjustment and more repetition. And over time I learned to skip steps that your biology performs automatically." "What do you mean, skip steps?" Catharan asked. "When you see a target, your enhanced eyes send a signal to your enhanced brain, which sends a signal to your enhanced muscles. And all of that happens faster than any human could match. But it still happens in sequence, one step after another." She holstered the pistol. "I train my brain to predict where targets will be before I see them move, to recognize patterns and calculate trajectories unconsciously, so that by the time my slow eyes and slow muscles respond, I am already aiming at where the target will be, not where it was." She could see Catharan processing this information, his warrior's mind working through the tactical implications. "You are saying that you compensate for inferior biology through superior prediction." "Not just prediction," Alara said. "Adaptation, because that is what humans do. We find our weaknesses and we build systems to overcome them. And we practice those systems until they become instinct." A Gorvek delegate had pushed through the crowd to listen, his massive form towering over both of them, and he rumbled a question in his deep voice. "But surely there are limits to what practice can achieve. Biological realities that cannot be overcome through mere training." Alara nodded. "Of course there are limits. I could practice for 1,000 years and never match a Norvaxian in a pure reflex competition. But combat is not about pure reflexes. It is about combining every tool you have in the most effective way possible. She looked around at the gathered delegates, species from across the galaxy who had come to watch a primitive be humiliated and instead witness something they could not explain. Humans have been fighting each other since before we had words to describe what fighting meant. And every generation we found new ways to kill each other more effectively, new weapons and new tactics and new training methods. And the ones who survived passed their knowledge to the next generation. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. We did not have genetic perfection. So we invented practice, we invented discipline. We invented the idea that any skill could be mastered if you were willing to fail enough times and learn from each failure. She pointed at the score display still glowing above the arena. That number does not represent my genetics. It represents 20 years of daily practice, 10,000 hours of training, 1,000,000 rounds fired at targets until the act of shooting became as natural as breathing. Catharan was silent for a long moment, his 4 eyes studying her with an intensity that felt almost physical. You said you are not even the best on your ship. He finally said, "Is that true?" "It is true," Elara confirmed. "I am good, perhaps very good. But there are humans who would make my score look average. Humans who have dedicated their entire lives to a single skill until they became the best in the world at that one thing. And there are many such humans?" "Millions," Elara said. "In every field you can imagine. From combat to art to science to athletics. Humans who push past every limit their biology tried to impose until they achieved things that should have been impossible." She let that sink in for a moment. "You asked what gift humans have. What defining trait makes us valuable? And the answer is this. We do not accept that our birth determines our potential. We believe that excellence can be built through effort and will. And we have proven it true over and over again throughout our history." The Gorvak delegate made a sound that might have been laughter. "This is either the most inspiring thing I have ever heard or the most terrifying. I am not certain which. Perhaps both," Elara said with a small smile. Catharan turned and looked at the other delegates who had gathered around them. And when he spoke again, his voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "I have lived for 300 years and fought in 47 battles against 11 different species. And I have never seen anything like what I witnessed today." He looked back at Elara. "I came here to expose humanity as pretenders who did not belong among true warriors. And instead, I have learned that I may have underestimated your entire species." Ambassador Yenli had made her way down to the arena floor, her skin now glowing that strange gold-silver color, and she approached the group with careful steps. "High Warlord," she said, "does this demonstration change your position on human integration into the Defense Pact?" Catharan was quiet for several heartbeats, and Elara could see him weighing his answer when he finally spoke. His voice was thoughtful in a way she had not expected. "It raises questions I had not considered before, and I would be a fool to ignore what I have seen with my own eyes." He looked at Elara one more time. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion in the assembly hall, where the rest of the delegates can hear what we have learned today." Elara nodded. "I would like that very much, High Warlord." As they walked toward the exit, surrounded by delegates still arguing about what they had witnessed, Elara allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had not just won a marksmanship competition, she had opened a door that had been closed to humanity since first contact, and tomorrow she would walk through it. The Grand Assembly Hall looked different in the morning. Light that filtered through the station's massive viewport cellar sat in the human delegation section and watched as representatives from 30 species filed into their seats. And she noticed immediately that the atmosphere had changed. Yesterday, the other delegates had looked at humans with dismissal and contempt, glancing their way only to confirm their own superiority today. They looked at humans with something else entirely. Some looked curious, leaning forward to study Elara as if she were a puzzle they wanted to solve. Others looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact as if they were embarrassed by assumptions they had made. And a few, Alara noticed, looked almost afraid. Ambassador Yenli sat beside her with skin glowing that same gold-silver color from the night before, and her large dark eyes were bright with an emotion that might have been excitement or hope or both. "The recordings have spread through the entire station," Yenli whispered. "Everyone has seen what happened in the arena, and everyone is talking about it. What are they saying?" Alara asked. "Many things," Yenli replied. "Some are calling it a fluke or claiming you must have cheated somehow. But most are simply trying to understand how a species they dismissed as primitive could produce someone like you." The assembly's call to order chimes sounded through the hall, and the murmuring delegates fell silent as the session began. Several routine matters were addressed first: trade agreements and patrol schedules and resource allocations. But everyone knew what topic truly filled the room finally. The speaker called for discussion of humanity's role in the Galactic Defense Pact, and a dozen delegates immediately signaled their desire to speak. The first was a Marathi scientist who had spent the night analyzing the recordings from the arena. "I have run the numbers 17 times, she said, her voice carrying the weight of mathematical certainty, "and I cannot explain what I observed through any model of human capability that we currently possess. The commander's performance exceeded our projections for human potential by a factor of 3. She looked at Alara across the hall. "Either our understanding of human biology is fundamentally flawed, or humans have access to some enhancement technology we have not detected. Or there is a third possibility that I find difficult to accept." "What possibility is that?" another delegate asked. The Marathi hesitated before answering. "That humans have found a way to exceed their biological limits through training alone. That they have somehow discovered how to build capabilities that evolution did not give them." More murmuring filled the hall, and Alara saw delegates exchanging glances that ranged from skeptical to alarmed. An Orwellian historian rose to speak next, his perfect memory providing context that others lacked. "I have been reviewing Earth's historical records since last night's demonstration, and I found something troubling. Humans have a history of warfare that spans thousands of years, not against other species, but against each other. And during that time, they developed weapons and tactics that grew more deadly with each generation." He paused to let his words sink in. "They created devices capable of destroying entire cities, poisons that could kill millions, machines of war that we would consider advanced by any galactic standard. And they did all of this while fighting only themselves. Imagine what they might create when faced with external threats." The hall fell silent as the implications settled over the assembly like a heavy blanket. Alara understood what was happening. The delegates were no longer seeing humanity as primitives who needed protection. They were starting to see humans as something potentially dangerous, a species that had forged itself through millennia of internal conflict into something the galaxy had never encountered before, a species that did not accept limitations. High Warlord Catharan rose from his seat, and his massive form drew every eye in the hall. "I came to this summit with a clear position," he said, his deep voice filling the chamber. "I believed that humans were too weak and too slow and too fragile to contribute anything meaningful to our defense alliance. And I challenged Commander Vance to prove me wrong." He looked at Alara, and she saw something in his 4 eyes that had not been there before. "Respect. She did more than prove me wrong. She showed me that I had been asking the wrong question entirely. I asked what biological gifts humans possess, when I should have asked what humans can achieve when they refuse to accept the limits of their biology." He turned to address the full assembly. "We Norvaxians have spent 10,000 generations breeding for perfection, slowly improving ourselves through genetic selection. But humans have achieved remarkable things in a fraction of that time through sheer stubborn refusal to accept their weaknesses." His voice grew thoughtful. I do not know if that makes them admirable or terrifying, but I do know this. I would rather have such a species standing beside us than facing us across a battlefield. The hall erupted in discussion as delegates debated Ketharan's words. And Alara watched as opinions shifted and alliances formed, and the future of her species was decided by beings from distant stars when the vote finally came. It was not even close. Humanity was granted full integration into the Galactic Defense Pact, not as auxiliaries or support staff, but as full combat partners with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed more than that. Several delegations formally requested human instructors for their own military forces, eager to learn the training methods that had produced someone like Commander Vance. As the session ended and delegates began filing out of the hall, Ilara made her way to the observation deck where she had stood just 2 days before. The stars looked the same as they had then. Countless points of light scattered across the infinite darkness. But everything else had changed. Ambassador Yenli found her there, standing at the viewport with her grandfather's pistol resting in her hand. "You did something remarkable today," Yenli said. "Not just the shooting, though that was impressive enough, but what you said afterward. You changed how they see your species." Ilara turned the pistol over in her hands. Feeling the familiar weight of it, I just told them the truth. Humans have never been special in the ways that matter to the galaxy. We are not faster or stronger or smarter than the species we have met. But we do not let that stop us. She holstered the weapon and looked out at the stars. We find our limits and we push past them. We fail and we learn and we try again. We build systems to compensate for our weaknesses, and we practice those systems until they become strengths. Yenli's skin shifted to a thoughtful blue. Is that really enough to make a difference in a galaxy full of species who were born with advantages you can never match? Ilara considered the question as a new ship appeared in the distance. A human transport arriving at the station. The first wave of Earth's contribution to the Galactic Defense Pact. "I do not know," she admitted. "But I know that my people have faced impossible odds before. We have survived ice ages and plagues and wars that killed millions. We have stood at the edge of extinction and refused to fall." She watched as the human ship grew larger in the viewport, carrying soldiers and engineers and scientists who would scatter across the galaxy and show other species what humanity could do. "We are not perfect," she said. "We never have been, but we are very, very good at becoming better. And maybe in a galaxy that values what you are born with, that makes us something new. Something dangerous?" Yenli Eskedalara smiled, the same small smile she had worn in the arena. "Something useful," she said. "At least to our allies." She watched the human ship dock at the station, watched as her people began their new role in a galaxy that would never see them. The same way again, they were still fragile and slow and short-lived compared to so many other species, but they were also stubborn and adaptable and absolutely unwilling to accept that their limitations defined their potential. And sometimes, Alara thought, that was enough. Sometimes that was everything.